Dave, we've been talking about civic virtues, what it means to be a virtuous citizen.
Long lost art.
As I say that, as those words roll off my tongue, I'm sitting here thinking how old-fashioned we sound, right? That's not a topic. If you turn on MSNBC right now, I guarantee they are not talking about the virtues of citizenship.
Do virtuous citizens walk uphill both ways in the snow?
They might. But the founders made the argument, and I think they're right. If you don't have a nation of virtuous citizens, the whole thing doesn't work. You can't have a limited constitutional government and protections for private property and large realms of individual freedom if you don't have virtue among the citizens. Because it means that if government's going to be very limited, then it means the citizens they're responsible for a lot, primarily for taking care of themselves and their loved ones. Mm-hmm. And so we've distilled down the civic virtues into four. And these are sort of like the four biggies, right? I mean, right. They each one spins off in a number of directions. But we've boiled it down to the idea of self-restraint. Citizens need to be able to govern and restrain and control themselves. They need to be self-assertive. They need to be willing and able to stand up and defend their rights, call out threats to their rights, whether it's coming from fellow citizens or even those in government who might be threatening their rights. They need some civic knowledge, and they have to be self-reliant. Those are the four big civic virtues. And last time we were just transitioning from the idea of self-assertion to civic knowledge, and we wound up our last conversation by talking about possible kinds of rights. And because
essentially where you should assert yourself.
That's right.
What rights do you have that you should assert yourself to maintain, and you should respect that other people have those equal rights as well.
I'm just going to throw out one hypothetical to get the gears in the minds of our listeners going. If government comes along and is going to tell you who you must hire in your business or what color skin an employee must have or must not have in your business, is government violating your rights or not? Well, that all depends on what your rights are, right? If your business is your property or if it's not. And so we were talking about three kind of buckets of rights, three main categories. And this subject is so confusing today because the truth is, I often like to think of the old hypothetical if an alien came down to Earth and just spent some time. If an alien came down to Earth and listened to mainstream news for 2 or 3 weeks, that alien would likely think that rights are anything and everything people want. That there's no strict definition to it because that's the way we talk about it, right? People have a right to affordable health care. People have a right to affordable housing. People have a right to not be offended. I mean, people throw out all kinds of notions. And so we want to offer some clarity as to what rights really are and what they're not. And we suggested 3 categories, 3 buckets: natural rights, civil rights, and the idea of economic rights / entitlements. I'm going to use those. We'll use those phrases interchangeably: economic rights and entitlements. And so let's just walk through them here. Basically, a natural right is a rightful claim, something to which you have a rightful claim by nature, meaning a natural right doesn't come from a law, doesn't come from a government. It doesn't emanate from any regulation or anything like that. It means just by your nature. If you were on a desert island, you would still have a rightful claim to these things because they're inherent in your nature. Right. And then, of course, the question is, well, what kind of things do you have an inherent, intrinsic, natural, rightful claim to? Well, your own person. Mm-hmm. Certainly no other person, no other human being has a rightful claim to your person, right? Mm-hmm. Your body, your mind, your labor, things that you create with your labor, your property. Sure. Those are all your natural rights.
Inventions, ideas.
Ideas in your head, that belongs to you. The words that either roll off of your tongue or come from your pen as you're writing or your keyboard as you're typing, those words are yours. Your thoughts, your ideas, your labor, your property, your person. You have a natural right to all of those things. And since you have a natural right to your person, to your liberty, your property, and so do I, and so does every other human being. And we agree then that no one's going to do any kind of ruling. No one's going to rule others unless they have their consent, their permission.
Right.
We make that agreement. Nobody's ruling anybody here unless you get our permission. And what does that look like in practice? How do we go about voicing our permission, giving our consent for any ruling to happen? Usually, typically, that takes place in the form of elections. That's when we give our consent. We are authorizing this person to serve in this limited capacity, this constitutionally defined office for this limited period of time, and exercise these few powers for now.
And let's remind everybody that this is what Thomas Jefferson meant when he said all men are created equal. He meant that we all equally have these rights. I don't have more of a right to my person than you have to your person. I don't have more of a right to my property than you do to your property. It doesn't matter.
You might have more property.
Right.
You might have more property.
That's a really good point.
We might be unequal in how much property. Suppose I have, here's my property, tiny little bit of property. You have a great big amount of property. The way that we're equal is in our right to our own property. I have the same right to my little bit of property, and I can try to be productive with it. I can try to make it more if I want to, that you have to your great big property.
That is in the way that we are all equal. That is the moral objective truth that the Declaration, or one of the moral objective truths that the Declaration was written and based upon, was these rights are equal.
They're equal.
And they come from nature, and they're given to everybody, regardless of race, sex, skin color, ethnicity, religion, anything else you can think of.
Doesn't matter if you're good looking or ugly. You have the same equal natural rights.
Now, does that mean that we both can be models, or neither of us can be models? Maybe that's the equality.
Hey, man, I just feel sorry for anybody who looks at a magazine that I appear in the centerfold of. But okay, so the bottom line is we're all equally human.
Right.
We're equally human. The pretty and the ugly, the smart and the stupid, the rich and the poor. We're all equally human, which is why we have the same equal individual natural rights to our own property, our own liberty. And then once we form a civil society, once we come together and say, as the founding generation did, well, let's form a government. Because while we have equal natural rights, they're not always secure.
Right.
There are always enemies out there. There are always bad people trying to, sometimes it's fellow citizens that are trying to steal our stuff, violate our rights. Sometimes it's people from foreign countries. They're going to send an army or a navy to invade us and kill us and take our stuff. We need a government to protect our individual natural rights.
And it's interesting to think about, because we need that government in that circumstance, because without it, we would all just be in self-defense mode 24/7.
Yeah.
And the goal of being a human being is to be productive. And we're going to get into that a little bit later. But if the goal is to be productive, and instead you're constantly worrying about self-defense, if I can't trust that my house is secure, that I can rely on the rest of society generally to be accepting of my rights and I'm accepting of theirs, and we're both going to be virtuous citizens, and there might be those one or two bad apples that we need a government to handle, by not having to be in self-defense mode, because the civil society exists, because we agree to give up those limited rights that you talk about. That's how we can go then be productive and have success in life.
You've been getting into dystopian literature and movies, and
Netflix is full of it lately, and with everything happening, it just goes with the mood.
It kind of does. And the thing is, what those dystopian stories reveal, what they show is, when people are terrified, they get a little modicum of food or medicine or any other kind of resource necessary for life. And when there's no government, there's no security of property, they're so scared that someone's going to steal it. They spend all their time and energy trying to hide it, conceal it, keep it safe. Those kinds of people tend not to be very productive. How can they be?
Or they give up. Or they just say, I'm not going to try to have any property because I'm not going to be able to keep it because there are people who are stronger than me out there. There are people who are more dangerous than me. There are people who are more vicious than me, whatever you want to define it as, who are going to harm me if I have anything. They're going to harm me until I disclose where it is. So instead, I'd just rather have nothing than have some piece of property.
So we're on this path. We're taking this little journey. We're talking about this idea of human equality, which led to this notion of equal individual natural rights. That leads to the idea we need to form a government to protect those rights, knowing that governments are both necessary and dangerous, always at the same time. That never changes. Even the best designed government contains within it the potential for injustice, the potential for tyranny. So government's one of those things like a fire.
Right.
You always want to tend to it. You don't ever want to ignore it because it might get out of control and become a wildfire.
You want to keep it small. You want to keep it contained.
Yeah.
You have a fire pit, and you want to keep the fire the fire pit because if it gets outside of that, look out.
It's useful in the fireplace. It's disastrous when it starts climbing up mountains, right, and turns into a big mountain wildfire. And so we agree we're going to form a government. And then the question is, now we're in civil society. We are forming a civil society. How do we as citizens who agreed to form this government for one purpose, to protect our individual natural rights, to protect our natural rights, not to protect the natural rights of people around the world? That's not why we form a civil society and a civil government. We here in the United States, we form a government to protect our rights.
Right.
It's not that we don't care about the rights of others. It's just that's not the job of our government. People in other countries, other continents, they're free to form their own governments to protect their rights. That's not the purpose of our government, it's to protect our rights. And then the question is, how do we participate within our own government? How are we going to control it? How do we be part of it? That leads to the notion of civil rights. Now, civil rights are very different from natural rights in that natural rights exist by nature. Civil rights, by definition, exist within civil society. They have to be created by civil legislation.
Right.
So the example, we say no one's going to do any ruling without our consent, and the way we give our consent is through elections. Well, when is the election going to be? How is the election going to be run? What kind of ballot are we going to vote on? Or what kind of rigged software are we going to use for our voting machines? So somebody has to, right? We got to decide these things.
And we have to decide what is allowed to be on that ballot and what's not allowed to be on that ballot.
Yes.
What is the scope of which can be on that ballot?
And we decide other things. Who is qualified to vote? Should 3-year-olds vote? Should 6-year-olds vote? Should someone sitting in prison who's been convicted of a felony, should they be voting? Someone who's serving in the military, who's a citizen but is gone out of the country, should they vote? And if the answer is yes, what's the process for them to vote at an election when they're far away? All these matters have to be clarified by legislation. So in that sense, civil rights are rights that come from laws, that are enshrined in laws. Things like detailing the right to vote, therefore, is a civil right whose purpose is to protect our natural rights. This government we create, it's going to protect our rights, so it's going to prosecute criminals. If the government accuses us of a crime, we say, well, we want a right to be judged by a jury of our peers, right, at a trial. So things like trials, criminal trials, juries, these are civil rights because trials don't exist in nature. Juries don't exist in nature. There has to be a legal process for how these things work.
You just hit on something really important that we've talked about many times. I mean, we've been doing this long enough that there's some repeats here, but I want to remind people, right? Natural rights exist whether we acknowledge them or not.
That's right.
Right? Natural rights exist in nature. It's your example from the American Idea Toolbox about the Pythagorean theorem.
Mm-hmm.
The Pythagorean theorem, the idea that the sum of the square of the two legs of a right triangle equal the square of the hypotenuse.
Good job.
I think I got that right.
Your high school geometry
Yes.
teacher would be very happy.
I do remember it. I just didn't know if I could explain it. Anyway, that theorem, that idea, that is always there. It was there before Pythagoras discovered it.
Mm-hmm.
It existed. It was true when he discovered it, and he was the only one who knew it.
Yep.
And it was true long. It will be true long after, when millions and billions of people know it.
Yeah.
Gravity. The idea of gravity, the idea of the laws of motion. These are things that exist whether somebody recognizes them or not. And all we're doing is learning enough to be able to recognize them. The nature's laws, the laws of the natural laws, those are always there. Mm-hmm. You have a right to your life, liberty, and property, your life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, whether anybody acknowledges it or not.
But let me give a concrete example of what that looks like. For many centuries, actually for millennia, thousands of years, human beings lived enslaved by others,
Right.
legally enslaved, and many of those slaves did not know that their own enslavement was wrong, was unjust, and yet it was. It was unjust. It was wrong. Even if a slave cannot make the moral argument why it's wrong for someone else to own him as a piece of property, it's still wrong for someone else to own him as a piece of property.
There's a lot of people today who would like to make the argument that, oh, we're special today. We are now in the 21st century, and now we understand that slavery is wrong, and now we've come to the conclusion that slavery is wrong. No, slavery was always wrong. It's not like now that we've decided it's wrong, all those people 200, 500, 5,000 years ago, that they were not wrong then because nobody thought it was wrong.
Right.
They were wrong then. It was the idea that we understand it just confirms it. It confirms an understanding of the natural law. The civil law, those don't exist until people come into agreement and say, okay, we know we have to make certain concessions to make the world function well so that we can all be productive, and we want to create a system of laws that maximize our productivity as people. So therefore, let's just go ahead and create these limited laws around the government by constraining the government in this way. If we do that correctly, that's where the civil code comes from.
And by definition, civil law, civil rights are embedded in civil law, pieces of legislation. Now, that can change. Laws can change. They do change. And the question is a change in the law good or bad? Is it, when a law is created for the first time, is it a just law or an unjust law? And the standard by which we should be judging all civil laws is the standard of natural rights. We should say, well, does this law work to protect the natural rights of citizens? If so, that's a good law. If a law is created that violates natural rights, I'll give you an example. This is really far-fetched. This could never ever happen in the United States. But suppose a presidential administration wanted to define conservatives as domestic terrorists, and they were going to pass a law, right, and say basically if you voted for certain Republicans in the past, we're going to silence you, or we're not going to let you be on social media. We're going to restrict your liberty. Maybe we'll put you in prison. Who knows? Yeah. Or we'll place you in a higher tax bracket. You got to pay progressives in government more if you used to vote for conservative Republicans.
Right.
Those laws would be patently unjust. Set aside whether they're unconstitutional or not. Even before you get to the Constitution, there's the moral question of a law can be manifestly unjust if it violates the natural rights of individual citizens. Civil rights properly understood should help to protect our natural rights and offer legal pathways and processes by which we can participate in our own civil governance. So the right to vote, for example, that is a legitimate civil right. If all citizens have the same natural rights, all men, women, males, females, white, black, brown, purple, green, yellow, right? Doesn't matter what color they are, doesn't matter what sexual preferences they have. All citizens have the same natural rights. Therefore, it follows all citizens should have the same civil right to vote.
Right.
Because all of us citizens are living under the same government, we should all have the same right to vote. The right to a trial by jury. If you're accused of a crime, every citizen, man, woman, rich, poor, the pretty, the ugly, the smart, the stupid, every citizen should have a right that is written into law that says you have the civil right to a trial by jury if you're accused of a crime. Now, where we've gone off the rails in recent decades is calling all kinds of other things civil rights. And that's going to lead us to this third notion, which I'm almost hesitant to use the phrase economic rights. That was a phrase that Franklin Roosevelt really popularized back in the 1930s because they're not rights at all.
Well, unfortunately, we have a lot of people in Congress right now using that same term.
Yeah.
So it's probably worth addressing and speaking their language.
And there's also all kinds of other paths here that this notion of rights. So the most famous landmark piece of civil rights legislation is the 1964 Civil Rights Act.
Right.
And two sections of it. Article 2, there's only 7 sections in the original legislation. Article 2 and Article 7 have nothing to do with civil rights. One is a section on public accommodations, and it says if you invest your own capital and start your own business, we in the government are going to tell you, command you, who you must interact with and engage in exchanges with, and who you're free to decline offers from. Now, that's bossing someone around. That has nothing to do with the civil right, because for this simple reason, if you open a restaurant, you open a movie theater, you open a bed and breakfast, you open any kind of business, you open the Vino Veritas Society,
right?
Nobody has a right to come and make you trade with them. They don't. You're free to, that's your business, your property, run it however you want. Another section of the Civil Rights Act says if you start a business, we're going to tell you who you're going to hire, what skin color, what gender people are going to have, who you're going to hire, who you may fire, and for what reasons, in what situations. That too, that's not a civil right. Well, nobody has a civil right to come and work for you.
And take that further. You know, we're hearing the expansion of those ideas today. When Elizabeth Warren says you have to have a certain number of women on your board of directors, or you have to have a certain number of these people on your board of directors, it's no longer your business. It's the government's business. You're almost a caretaker. You're a shepherd of the government's business when they're starting to tell you all of those things. And the truth is they have been since the 1930s. The government has been telling us how to run our businesses, what we're allowed to do, what we're not allowed to do, what we have to produce, what we're not allowed to produce, how much we're allowed to produce,
what you'll charge,
what we'll charge, who will sell to,
what you'll pay your employees,
right? Who will employ, all of those things. It no longer makes you a business owner; it makes you a business shepherd.
Right now, there's a big push. What's the phrase? Fight for 15, which is to raise the minimum wage to $15 across the United States, regardless whether your business is on the verge of failing or not, whether you live in some inexpensive little rural town or you live in downtown Manhattan in New York City where costs are, doesn't matter. We in the government, we're going to command everyone how much they must pay. And you know how that's being marketed? As a civil right.
Right.
That Americans have a civil right to a basic minimum wage of $15, which raises all kinds of other questions. Why not $20 or $50 or $100?
Some are pushing that.
Well, that could be. So you see, as we go from natural rights, I think it's pretty clear. Things you have a right to by your nature, which is whatever belongs to you naturally, your freedom, your property, your person. Now we move over in this realm of civil rights, rights that are created by legislation, and it starts to get murky because there are legitimate civil rights like voting and enjoying trials by juries when you're accused of a crime. And by the way, for the record, I will say today, so far as I know, if I'm in error, I would ask some of our members to correct me. As far as I know, not one citizen is deprived of one civil right, legitimate civil right by law in the United States today. I don't know of a jurisdiction that has legislation that says women may not vote or poor people don't get trials when they're accused of crime. I don't know of one jurisdiction.
Right.
Every city, every state, across the United States, all citizens have legal access to their civil rights. They can vote. They're protected by the law in their property. But then we get all this other legislation that calls itself civil rights. That has nothing to do with civil rights. It's central planning. It's giving government at the federal level and the state level enormous power over our property, our lives, our private businesses. And then you have this third bucket, which is a disaster. This idea of economic rights. And this came in the 1930s is when this was really first unveiled by Franklin Roosevelt. And the idea is you have a right not only to your own person and your own liberty. You can speak your mind and, use your labor and create whatever you want to. In addition to that, you have the right to a house, and you have a right to a job, and you have a right to health care, and you have a right to education. You have a right to things that have to be produced by others.
Right.
Now, this is all of a sudden a very different concept, right? Because when you talk about your right to free speech or your right to keep whatever you earn or produce, those are all things you can do, right? What do you need to speak freely? What do you need from me? You don't need anything from me. Just make sure that I don't come and assault you or something, right? But you are free to speak your mind and think freely.
Which is now a problem, right? There are many of us out there who are afraid to speak our mind against our government, which is the point, right? It's less about I have a right to go speak my mind about somebody down the street. It's more about speaking your mind against the government without being beheaded for it like you would in many Middle Eastern countries or certain South American countries.
I've seen here within recent months, some other time we'll do a historical study of the Alien and Sedition Acts. Maybe that can be a toolbox video. This is going way, way, way back to the John Adams administration in the 1790s, and Congress passes these disastrous pieces of legislation, the Alien and Sedition Act. And the Sedition Act was particularly nefarious. It empowered the federal government to go punish people who wrote things critical of the federal government. All of a sudden, it had this incredible chilling effect of people were really caught. You might be thrown in prison if you write something and publish something critical of your own government. And what I've seen in the last few months among progressive intellectuals and academics, there's a resurgence of literature defending those things, saying that was a good idea. We should go back and revisit that model and reinstitute them. So here we are with this convoluted idea that citizens have some rightful claims to the property and labor of others. That's what an economic right really means. That's why I'm reluctant to even say the word economic right, because these aren't rights. I don't have any rightful claim to the labor of someone else. But when I say I have a right to health care,
right?
You like to point out, well, people will immediately go to the question, who's going to pay for it? But even before you get money involved, just if I truly have a right to health care and I don't know anything about medicine, I can't deliver health care to myself. What am I saying? I'm saying somebody else has an obligation to come and provide health care for me. Some doctor, some nurse, some x-ray technician somewhere has that obligation.
And think about how that devalues the product or the service being provided. When you think about education, when you think about health care, when you start to believe I have a right to it, you no longer are appreciative of what you're getting, right? If you have a right to education, and we've talked about this. My mother and my stepfather were both teachers. You were a teacher for a long time. I think about everything that we've had, all the conversations I've had with them over the years. And I think about the fact that how devalued the service they actually provided, the breadth of knowledge that they provided young children throughout a 30, 40-year career in education, and how unappreciative most people were of it, not because they didn't think they were getting a good education, but because they thought they were entitled to it.
Yeah, let's contrast that. Just a quick mental image here. What's your favorite exotic sports car? If you could go have any you wanted, what would you pick? Some really expensive, high-end, fancy car.
Let's just say a Ferrari.
A Ferrari. Right. When you think of the Ferrari, right? You think, wow, I got to save up a lot of money, hundreds of thousands, $1 million to go buy my dream Ferrari, because that's what it's worth. And most people just dream about these things. They're never able to buy them because they never are able to save up enough money. The few who do go buy them, they walk in and they have saved up. They've created a lot of wealth, and they write out a check for $1 million or whatever it is, and they drive off in their brand new Ferrari because it's a lot. It's worth that much. Contrast that, how people think about the Ferrari and why it's so expensive, versus how they think of education as they're thinking to themselves, I have a right to it.
Yeah.
I have a right to it. That means somebody else out there better just come give it to me. I don't even care who it is. Somebody better come give me some education. Mm-hmm. In that sense, it really does. They're not looking up at education as this wonderful, valuable thing, and I'm going to work and save so I can buy that someday for myself or for my kids. They kind of look down on it.
Yeah.
Somebody better get busy and give me some education or give some education to my kids. They don't think about the Ferrari that way.
Right.
They look up at the Ferrari. Someday I hope to be able to go in and buy that car.
Little side note on that note, I actually was watching last week at a Mika Auto auction in Florida, one of Carroll Shelby's original, one of his own Shelbys that he drove. This was his car.
Yeah.
Sold for $5.6 million at auction. 5.4, sorry, I want to get that right. $5.4 million at auction. Yeah. Fully restored 1965 Shelby American Cobra. And people think, I can't believe they'd spend that money on that and this. But if you gave that same guy who bought it looked like he was mid-50s, maybe 60. Mm-hmm. You don't just come into that kind of money out of nowhere, mm-hmm. right? He's probably had money for a while. Mm-hmm. And I think about if he sat there and 10 years ago, 20 years ago, he had kids entering high school.
Yep.
And he was saying, there's this teacher out there. There's this one teacher. This teacher is unbelievable. And I want my kids to have access to that teacher.
His name's Cranwitter. Go ahead.
If he's thinking that,
yeah.
and he's willing, he put a value on that car. Mm-hmm. I guarantee this same type of guy is looking at private schools. He's thinking about Exeter. He's thinking about some of these other schools that you can send your kids to. But what if instead he just said, you know what? That education, having that teacher available to my children, I'll put $1 million in to get that.
Right.
That's how you start to value teachers.
Right.
And for years I've gotten frustrated by the conversation when people say, I can't believe we pay athletes this much money and we only pay teachers this much.
Right.
But it's because we have devalued the role of teaching.
Yes.
We have told people, you have a right to education. It doesn't matter if the teacher's good or not. We're going to pay all teachers the same, and everybody's going to be entitled to learn from a teacher who's going to be paid the same exact amount.
You, the citizens, you don't need to save up anything. In fact,
right.
In fact, you know what's going to cost you? Nothing, or next to nothing. In fact, maybe the expensive exotic cars. Boy, I would love to see that Shelby. That's so extreme. Let's bring it down to something that's actually very realistic and very common. Big screen TV. Mm-hmm. Lots of people have big screen. Even many people who are under the poverty line, living under the poverty line, have big screen TVs.
Especially if they're in Minnesota after the riots last summer.
That's right.
Probably an inappropriate joke, but first thing that came to mind.
Sure. Well, when you have those kinds of riots, a lot of people all of a sudden have big screen TVs.
Well, maybe there's a right to television.
Yeah. Well, and what's interesting is there is no right to a TV. And so if somebody wants a big screen TV, they know, even poor people know, I'm going to have to save up a few $100s. Mm-hmm. Sometimes, Walmart or Target will have these sales, and $600, $800, you can actually go get a pretty nice big screen TV. Mm-hmm. But they know that they have to save up. They got to work. They got to be productive somehow, amass some money to go buy that. Those same people, millions of them, our fellow citizens, they don't think of education that way.
Right.
They think to themselves, you know what the education of my kids is worth? Nothing. I don't have to pay anything for it. And so that's that way of devaluing. That comes with this notion of economic rights.
Right. So the idea here of economic rights, I guess the biggest takeaway people have to remember is you don't have a right to those things at all, because they require somebody else providing you that service.
That's right.
In the end, government doesn't have a bottomless there aren't government money trees, right? You always heard your parents growing up. What do you think money grows on trees?
Right.
The government doesn't have a magic money tree either. And there's only so much money. And one of two things has to happen. If they're going to keep providing us these services, if we really do have a right to those things and the government's going to be the one to pay for it, really that's either coming back on us or they're printing money or they're creating debt. And as you keep devaluing that, and as the government keeps having their budget slashed and they can't afford things, what do? They start pushing down on teachers. And I think back to all of the teacher strikes over the years, thinking these teachers are asking for more money, and they're going to a government. They're saying, "Okay, we've given you all the power, and we've devalued ourselves by telling you that you should. What we provide is a right to everybody. There's no real value in it because everybody has a right to it." But we still want you to pay us, and we still want you to pay us more.
Right.
And the government's really thinking, no, if it's a right, you have to provide it. And if you're a good teacher, you have to go provide it. You don't have a choice. And eventually we end up in slavery.
And, we're just talking about education. The same holds true for for healthcare, the idea that you have a right to healthcare. Same holds true to food. If you think you have a right to food or a right to housing. The main point here we want to drive home is there is no such thing as an economic right. You don't have a right. You don't have a right to food. You don't have a right to a house. You don't have a right to education, to healthcare. You don't have a right to anything that requires the labor of someone else. For this simple reason, no one has an obligation to come and work for you, to come and provide these things. In fact, I would ask our listeners just to do a little mind experiment. For those who say, I have a right to health care, okay? Ask one simple question of them. Who has an obligation to come and take care of you when you're sick? An obligation, a duty. Right. And where did that duty come from? Where did some people all of a sudden get a duty to come and take care of this guy over here when he's sick or when he needs it? And the answer is they don't have a duty. Nobody has a duty. If you want someone's talent and time and attention, ask. I'll make an offer for it. That's how you get anything else that you want to buy. You make an offer for it, and maybe some physicians and nurses and medical technicians and others will agree to come help you for what you offer, and maybe they won't. That's the way that a market works. There's this other quirky part about these economic rights, and you really see it with the idea of a right to health care. If person A over here has a right to health care, it means some people, not everyone, but some, have to have an obligation to provide health care to person A. But there's this other question. What obligation does person A have then to be healthy, to take care of himself? If he has a right to health care and he's going to burden these people over here and demand that they come and take care of him, well then I would think he should have some kind of obligation to be really healthy and really fit and eat nutritious food and all that, not smoke, not drink, not do anything unhealthy. And the point is, when you drill down into this notion of economic rights, it all falls apart. They're great slogans. They are slogans that they've not only won a lot of elections, they've put people into the White House. You can become president of the United States by promising this fiction of economic rights. We're going to make sure you have a right to health care and a right to education. And we're here to say they don't exist. And the context for all this is this civic virtue of civic knowledge.
Right.
In order to be self-assertive and to know when your rights are being jeopardized and what responsibilities you have, you got to know something about what your rights are. You do have natural rights. You have a natural right to your life, liberty, and the free pursuit of happiness. You have a natural right to your own property, whatever you've earned or produced or created. You have a natural right to your person, to your body, to your mind. We should have civil rights that allow you to participate, if you're a citizen, to participate within civil society, to vote in elections, to make sure that you're not unduly persecuted for crimes you didn't actually commit. But there are no economic rights. So if those in government propose a law scaling back certain subsidies, we're going to cut some subsidy payments. We're not going to pay as much to farmers. We're not going to pay, government's not going to pay as much to people receiving food stamps. That is not a violation of anyone's natural rights.
Right.
It's not a violation of anyone's civil rights. It's actually a proper thing to do.
Right.
The fact that those subsidy programs were created in the first place, that's the problem.
Right.
The subsidies, the entitlements, that's the problem. That's the injustice.
Well, and think about how, if you do grant somebody these ideas of economic rights, how greatly they affect the other virtues that we're supposed to follow, right? If you think about the minute you say you have a right to health care and you never have to pay for it again, right? If I said, Tom, you have a right to health care, you never have to pay for health care ever again. What are you going to do tonight? I guarantee the first thing you're going to go home tonight, you're going to do is you're going to go home, you're going to make the biggest steak you can find, you're going to light the biggest cigar you can find, and you're going to have a couple glasses of scotch.
I might do that anyway.
You might do that
even though I don't have a right to health care.
but you're going to do that, but you're going to restrain yourself. You're not going to do that every night.
Right.
You know that's not healthy. You know
Right.
that's not the best way to live.
Right.
You know that's not in your long-term self-interest and best for you and best for the things that you value and the people who value you, right? It's your wife does not want that, right? She doesn't want you to live like that and grow into this 350 pound whatever.
And get sick and die.
Right, and get sick and die and have to take care of you when you're dealing with all of the health issues.
Yeah.
So knowing that you don't have a right to health care, you restrain yourself.
Yes.
It's not just in terms of how you act towards your fellow human beings. It's you restrain yourself and you assert yourself in a way that makes you the most productive, that makes your life, that puts you on a trajectory to having the best quality life that you possibly can.
Well, it's a great point. The invention of this lie, this fiction that there are economic rights, that whole notion really undermines responsibility. It disincentivizes responsibility. Whereas if we're living within civil society, just enjoying our natural liberty, saying we're not entitled to anything, but we're free and we can make of our lives what we want to make of it. Natural liberty incentivizes responsibility. Economic rights or economic entitlements incentivizes irresponsibility.
This whole conversation just took us on a full circle all the way back to one of our very first podcasts where we were talking about there were two choices in life.
Yeah.
For forever, there have been two choices in life. You either do nothing and die, or you're productive and you live.
Yeah.
That was it. These ideas of economic rights and the ideas of that include a right to a house, a right to a meal, a right to education, a right to healthcare, a right to whatever else you can come up with have been what have created this intermediary lane of idleness and disincentives to work and disincentives to be productive, which, as we've talked about, and I think we need to keep discussing. These are all of the negative social pathologies in this country have been established as a result of, I don't have any responsibility anymore. I can be idle. I can hurt my child because I can just take him to the ER and somebody's going to take care of him.
I can be neglectful of my parents because there's Social Security and other kind of government social safety networks. Somebody else will take care of them.
Until the death panels start, when they start asking, is this person worth saving?
Right.
When you have a right to health care, who has a right to health care? And how long does that right to health care last? And do you have a right to health care when you're 85 or do you have it when you're 65? And how long does that last?
And this comes with all economic, so-called economic rights, entitlements. When government says you're entitled to, whether it's health care, education, food, anything, that is going to involve central planning. Right. And central planners are going to sit and say, okay, we have these limited resources. How are we going to distribute them? And who deserves them and who doesn't? Who are the undeserving? And one thing we've learned from a century of the worst tyrannies in all of history, this is an amazing thing. In the most progressive era of history, it is marked by the greatest totalitarian tyrannies in all of history. And one thing we have learned from the study of tyrannies is it really sucks to be in a tyranny, a central planned tyranny, and to be one of the undeserving. One of the people the bureaucrats say that person doesn't deserve a house or health care or education or other things like that. It's really bad. So we say citizens, the third virtue they need to have is some civic knowledge. That means they have to understand what their rights actually are, understand their natural rights, understand civil rights properly, what really is a civil right, and all the things that are not civil rights that are paraded or disguised as if they're civil rights, and to be able to recognize this fiction, this falsehood, this idea of entitlements and economic rights. There is no rightful claim to other people's labor. And then that allows the citizen to look at, first of all, to look at his government and have a clear picture of what he should expect. I expect my government to protect the liberty and property of me and all my fellow citizens.
Right.
And once government starts talking about transferring wealth and taking from some people and giving to others, giving special perks and boosts to some people and putting special burdens on others, the virtuous citizen says, no. What we demand from you in government is equal protection of the laws for the equal natural rights of all citizens. None of this dividing us up into groups and giving special benefits to some and placing special burdens on others. And to be able to do that is going to require some self-assertion.
Right.
You got to be a self-assertive citizen and stand up and say, no, you in government, we won't let you stay in government if you keep doing that. And that's how this civic virtue of civic knowledge feeds right into the idea of self-assertion and self-restraint that we've talked about in the past podcast. Civic knowledge means understanding the proper purpose of government. It's so sorely needed. I suggest most of the political fighting that we witness would never happen. It simply wouldn't occur if citizens actually had civic knowledge, if they genuinely knew what their rights are, what the proper purpose of government is, which is to protect liberty and property, not transfer it, not give to some and take from others. Then most of the fighting, because think of every time Congress suggests cutting back a little bit of a subsidy. I'll give you this is sort of this perennial example. Cutting down taxpayer dollars goes to Planned Parenthood. Right. And there are a lot of Americans who say, no, I don't want my tax dollars going to Planned Parenthood. And whenever those in Congress talk about it, they just propose it. Maybe we'll scale back a little bit the subsidies we send to this private organization, right? Planned Parenthood. There are millions of Americans clamoring out there. That's a violation of our rights.
Right. It's a violation of women's rights.
Right. No, it's not. If you love Planned Parenthood, you think they do great work, by golly, you are free to send all your money to them.
And
send as much as you want.
And you're free to go get your friends to send money
Absolutely.
to them. The problem that arises, our government has taken this turn that started under Wilson, that started with progressivism, that was really sort of etched in stone by FDR, of this permanent government, the bureaucracy, right? Yeah. Who they've started to take control of all of these things. And all of a sudden, our civil rights to vote and our civil rights to determine who we want to give up some of our rights to have completely been taken away because the progressives have just put the Wilsonian idea of the permanent government in control of all of this.
And it cuts a couple of ways, that Wilsonian idea of they used to call it the administrative state or the permanent government. On the one hand, it violates our civil right, our natural right to consent to who governs us. It violates our natural right because we don't get to vote. All the bureaucrats employed by all these, alphabet soup bureaucracies, we don't vote for them. So it's a violation of our natural right to consent. And it gets even worse because those regulatory agencies, they've been sold as new kinds of civil rights. They've been sold as, Dave, you're a citizen, so you have a civil right. You have a right to clean air. And the EPA makes sure that we have clean air. Therefore, anybody who wants to cut back the funding of the EPA is violating Dave's civil rights, his right to clean air. Department of Education, right? We've told Americans you have a right to education. If anybody suggests there's all this bloat and waste and corruption in the Department of Education, let's just scale it back a little bit. instantly progressives stand up and say, you want to violate the rights to education of millions of Americans.
You know what's interesting about that is they still do call them civil rights, right? And civil rights are accurately defined as rights given by the government, right? Rights created through the government. So in a sense, they are right. By calling those things civil rights, they have a government giving them the right to health care. Now, whether that's moral, whether that's proper, whether that is beneficial, whether that accomplishes its goal is a totally different thing. But they're saying these things are civil rights. Right. What they've had to do as a result is they've had to say natural rights aren't real.
That's right.
Right? They say natural rights aren't real, so you have to protect civil rights, right? Civil rights are what matters. The progressives argue there's actually no such thing as natural rights.
Yes.
I don't know what an individual natural right is, but I do know that the government can define that I get these rights. And if you try to take those rights away, you might as well be a fascist, right? And that's exactly how they've defined it.
And the truth is, the very concept of economic rights, the right to a job, the right to health care, the right to education, any of those things, the economic rights is incompatible. That idea is incompatible with property, with private property. They cannot coexist. Very often our class of progressive politicians just kind of scoots past that problem, just ignores it, right? Brushes it under the rug. But there's this glaring contradiction because either you have a right to your property, which includes the money in your checking account. That's your property. You earned it. Or I have a right to a house and you have to pay for it. Right? We can't have both. We can have one or the other, but we can't, because if you really do have a right to your property, then I don't have any rightful claim to your money to make you buy a house for me. And if I have a rightful claim to your money to make you buy a house, then you don't really have a right to your private property. The first generation of progressives, going all the way back to the 1870s, 80s, 90s, that first wave of progressive thinkers, they were very clear in attacking and rejecting the concept of natural rights in the founding. In fact, the earliest progressive writers, they were more focused on the Declaration of Independence than they were the Constitution, because they knew the real problem, the real nut for them to crack was that concept of natural rights.
Sure.
Rights to our own liberty, our own property. They wanted to get rid of that in order to create a modern progressive administrative state of entitlements and economic rights.
So we have the virtues of self-restraint, of self-restraint, of self-assertion, all to understand where you restrain yourself and where you assert yourself to ensure your rights, which you have to understand civic knowledge to get there, right?
You need civic knowledge to know when to assert yourself.
When to assert yourself and when to restrain yourself.
That's right.
All of that is so that you can be productive.
Yeah.
Or in other words, self-reliant.
Right.
So if we're going to, it's sort of this continuum. You need to understand what it is to restrain yourself and what it is to assert yourself. You need to understand when to exercise those two virtues based on civic knowledge. And because of that, you can pick that productive lane and live rather than that unproductive lane and die.
If you exercise those other virtues and you're living freely and you want to stay free, you're going to need to be independent. Independent of government control. Independent, not dependent. You can't be dependent on others and be free. And that's going to require the virtue of self-restraint and of self-reliance.
Right.
And the challenge we have is time, because we've run out of it.
We're going to restrain ourselves.
We're going to restrain ourselves as much as our listeners want us to keep going on right now. And we're going to pick up in the next podcast on this notion of self-reliance and why, in many ways, it's the keystone of all the virtues and the idea of a free citizen.
And for anybody who has not watched both the American Idea Toolbox and the Progressive Toolbox, I would highly go back and recommend watching those two over the next week, because they're really going to play perfectly into that idea of self-reliance and what it is to be a free American citizen.
Until then, we remain the guardians of the American idea.
Nos sumos custodes.
Yep.